I never thought such a quiet night could change my life forever. It was March 27th, 1999, and I was about to discover that technology, no matter how advanced, can never completely replace the human factor in war. But to fully understand what happened that night, I need to go back a few weeks in time and explain how we got to that moment. My name is Dale Zelko, Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Air Force, and in that March of 1999, I was stationed at Aviano Air Base in northern Italy. I had arrived there a few weeks earlier as part of the growing American contingent preparing for what we all knew was inevitable: military intervention in the Balkans crisis. The situation in Kosovo was deteriorating rapidly. Slobodan Milosevic's Serbian forces were intensifying their operations against the Albanian population, and the international community had finally decided to act. Operation Allied Force was about to begin, and I would be a small but crucial part of it. Flying an F-117A Nighthawk wasn't just my job, it was my passion. I had become an Air Force pilot 20 years earlier, dreaming of flying fast and maneuverable fighters like the F-16 Fighting Falcon. But when the opportunity to pilot the revolutionary stealth program came up, I didn't hesitate to apply. The F-117 wasn't exactly what people imagined when they thought of a fighter. It was an attack aircraft, designed for precision bombing missions in hostile territory. Its angular and unusual design had nothing to do with aesthetics. Every facet, every angle had been carefully calculated to disperse radar waves, making the aircraft practically invisible to air defense systems. It was revolutionary technology, but it came with its own challenges. The F-117 wasn't easy to fly. Its flight characteristics were unique, requiring specific techniques and lots of practice. It took me months to feel truly comfortable with the controls, and even then, every flight was a learning experience. In the days leading up to the operation, we spent hours in detailed briefings about Serbian air defenses. Military intelligence had mapped every known surface-to-air missile system, every radar, every possible threat. The picture that emerged was complex, but not frightening for someone flying a stealth aircraft. The Serbians operated mainly older Soviet systems: SA-2 Guidelines, SA-3 Goas, SA-6 Gainfuls, and some mobile SA-8 Geckos. These were systems from the 1960s and 1970s, designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers from the Cold War era. Against an F-117, theoretically, they shouldn't pose a significant threat. But there was something the briefings couldn't fully capture: the human factor. On the other side of enemy lines, a Serbian officer named Zoltan Dani was preparing to prove that even the most advanced technology had its limitations. Dani was a veteran of the Yugoslav Air Defense Forces, a guy who had dedicated his career to understanding how to shoot down aircraft. He commanded the 3rd Battery of the 250th Missile Regiment, equipped with the S-125 Neva system, the export version of the SA-3 Goa. By the standards of the time, it was obsolete equipment. But Dani wasn't an ordinary commander. While other Serbian officers were preparing for war using conventional tactics, Dani was studying something completely different. He had gained access to technical information about stealth technology, not military secrets, but scientific articles published in specialized journals, analyses by aeronautical engineers, even some documents that had leaked over the years. What Dani discovered was fascinating. Stealth technology didn't make an aircraft completely invisible, it just drastically reduced its radar cross-section. More importantly, this invisibility was more effective against certain radar frequencies than others. And there were specific moments when even a stealth aircraft became temporarily more detectable. Armed with this knowledge, Dani began developing unconventional tactics. Instead of using his radars the traditional way, continuous sweeps looking for large, clear targets, he began experimenting with different techniques: spaced pulses, alternating frequencies, coordination between multiple systems. It was like trying to hear a whisper in the middle of a symphony, but he was determined to find a way. Meanwhile, at Aviano, I continued my preparation for war. The first attacks of Operation Allied Force had begun on March 24th, and I still hadn't flown a combat mission. That was about to change. The mission that would change my life was planned for the night of March 27th. The target was a Serbian command and control center on the outskirts of Belgrade. a building that coordinated military communications in the region. Destroying it could significantly hamper the response capability of Serbian forces. It was a typical F-117 mission: fly solo, attack a high-value target, and return without being detected. I had flown similar missions in training dozens of times. The only difference was that this time the people on the other side would really be trying to kill me. The briefing began at 14 WOS in the base operations center. The room was full of officers, intelligence analysts, meteorologists, and support personnel. On the walls, detailed maps of the region showed flight routes, known air defense systems, and priority targets. "Gentlemen, tonight's mission is critical to the success of the operation," the operations officer began. "The command center you'll be attacking is coordinating communications for 3 Serbian divisions. Destroying it will force the enemy to use less secure communication methods, giving us a significant tactical advantage." I studied the maps carefully. The route would take my F-117 over territory controlled by Serbian forces for more than 2 hours. There were multiple air defense systems along the way, but none that should be able to detect me. At least that's what we all believed. "Weather conditions are favorable," the briefing continued. "Clear skies, light winds, excellent visibility. New moon, so you'll have maximum darkness for the approach." That was awesome. The F-117 was designed for night operations, and darkness was our ally. But it also meant that if something went wrong, I'd be alone in the dark, in hostile territory, with no one to help me immediately. "Any questions about the mission?" asked the operations officer. I raised my hand. "What's the status of air defenses in the target area?" "Intelligence indicates normal SA-2 and SA-3 system activity in the region. Nothing that should pose a threat to your aircraft. You'll be informed of any changes via data link during the flight." It seemed straightforward. Fly there, attack the target, come home. Thousands of pilots had flown similar missions for decades. There was no reason to believe this would be different. After the briefing, I went to my quarters to rest. It was a routine I had developed over the years. A few hours of sleep before night missions, followed by a light meal and personal preparation. I tried to keep my mind focused but calm. At 17, I began my pre-flight preparation. First, personal equipment: flight suit, life vest, helmet, night vision goggles. Each item was carefully checked. In hostile territory, your equipment can be the difference between life and death. Then survival equipment: emergency radio, medical kit, emergency water and food supplies, compass, maps, and other essential items. All of this went with me in the cockpit, in special bags designed not to interfere with the aircraft's systems. At 18 Mo, I headed to the hangar, where my F-117 was being prepared. The aircraft was truly impressive, a masterpiece of engineering that seemed to come straight out of a science fiction movie. Its dark grey paint absorbed light, making it appear almost ethereal in the hangar's soft lighting. The maintenance crew was finishing the final checks. Every system had been tested and retested. The bombs, 2 2,000-pound GBU-27 Paveway 3s each, were loaded in the internal bay. Full fuel. Navigation and attack systems programmed with target coordinates. "All set, Colonel," said the maintenance crew chief, handing me the aircraft logbook. "She's perfect." I did my own pre-flight inspection, visually checking every surface of the aircraft. It was a ritual I never skipped, no matter how many times the maintenance crew had checked everything. My life depended on this machine, and I wanted personal assurance that everything was in order. At 19:00, I climbed into the cockpit. The F-117's interior was more Spartan than many modern fighters, but every control, every display, every switch had been positioned ergonomically for maximum efficiency. I knew every button by heart, every procedure by memory. I started the startup sequence. First, the APU auxiliary power unit to provide power to the systems. Then the flight, navigation, and attack computers. Each system went through its self-test sequence, confirming it was working correctly. "Aviano Tower, Nighthawk 27, requesting clearance for taxi," I transmitted over the radio. "Nighthawk 27, cleared to taxi to runway 27, winds calm, altimeter 3012. I started the F404GE F1D2 engines, feeling the familiar vibration and characteristic sound of the turbofans. It wasn't the powerful roar of a traditional fighter, The F-117 was designed to be quiet, even in the engines. The taxi to the runway threshold gave me time to mentally review the mission. Takeoff at 19:30, route over the Adriatic, entry into Serbian airspace at 20:45, target attack at 21:30, return to base at 23 Gara. Everything timed with military precision. At the runway threshold, I performed the final checks. Flight controls free and correct. Engines operating normally. Navigation systems aligned and programmed. Weapons armed and ready. Aviano Tower, Nighthawk 27 ready for departure. Nighthawk 27 cleared for takeoff. Contact departure on 1:25:35. Good luck, sir. I pushed the throttles forward and felt the familiar acceleration pressing me against the seat. The F-117 wasn't the fastest or most agile aircraft in the world, but it had a unique presence. In seconds, I was airborne, climbing smoothly through the Italian darkness. Aviano departure, Nighthawk 27 airborne. Nighthawk 27 radar contact. Climb and maintain flight level 250. Proceed as filed. I climbed through the sparse cloud layers, emerging under a crystal-clear starry sky. It was a perfect night for flying and for war. Below, the lights of Europe twinkled like jewels scattered on black velvet. Flying an F-117 at night was an almost meditative experience. The aircraft was stable, predictable, reliable. You didn't feel the adrenaline of flying an air superiority fighter, but there was something comforting in the certainty that you were practically invisible to enemy defense systems. Or at least, that's what I believed. While I flew peacefully over the Adriatic, on the other side of the sea, Zoltan Dani was putting weeks of preparation into practice. His S-125 missile battery was positioned in a carefully planned configuration, different from standard operational manuals. Instead of keeping his radars in continuous sweep, which would make them more detectable by American warning systems, Dani was using a technique he had developed specifically to hunt stealth aircraft, short-spaced pulses, at frequencies that theoretically should be more effective against stealth technology. More importantly, he had positioned his systems in a way that took advantage of the region's geographical characteristics. Hills and valleys could create corridors where even a stealth aircraft might be momentarily detectable. It was an untested theory, but Dani was about to find out if it would work. At 20:30, I was approaching the entry point into Serbian airspace. It was always a tense moment. You left relatively safe territory and entered a zone where every person on the ground was potentially an enemy. I activated all electronic warfare systems. The ALR-67 radar warning receiver was continuously monitoring all known frequencies, looking for signals from search radars or missile systems. The ALQ-178 was ready to jam any system that tried to track me. So far, everything was quiet. The RWR showed no significant activity, just some sparse sweeps from air traffic control radars, nothing that could detect me. I crossed the border at 20:45, exactly as planned. Below, the lights of civilization became more sparse. I was now over disputed territory, where a brutal civil war was destroying a country that had been considered a model of multiculturalism. Cruising altitude was 40,000 feet, well above most civil and military air traffic. From there, the Earth's curvature was clearly visible, and the contrast between illuminated areas and dark zones told the story of the conflict below. At 21, I was approximately 50 kilometers from my target. It was time to begin attack procedures. I gradually reduced altitude to 35,000 feet and decreased speed to optimized attack velocity. It was at this moment that something unusual happened. My RWR picked up a weak and intermittent signal. It wasn't the continuous tone of a traditional search radar, but spaced pulses, almost hesitant. For a few seconds, I thought it might be a system malfunction. Data link, Nighthawk 27, showing intermittent radar activity bearing 180 weak signal. Nighthawk 27, no known threats in that area. Probably ground-based air traffic control, continue as planned. It made sense, after all. I was flying an aircraft that was practically invisible. A few weak radar pulses didn't necessarily mean I was being tracked. But down below, Dani was much closer than I imagined. He had achieved something that seemed impossible, a weak but consistent detection of my F-117. It wasn't a complete radar lock. It was more like hearing distant footsteps in a silent forest, but he knew something was there. Most impressive was his patience. Many missile operators would have fired immediately upon detecting any signal. But Danny knew he had only one chance. The S-125 missiles weren't known for their accuracy against small, maneuverable targets. He needed to wait for the perfect moment. At 21:15, I was less than 30 kilometers from the target. I began final attack procedures. The inertial navigation system was working perfectly, guiding me directly to the programmed coordinates. The targeting system was tracking the target building through infrared sensors. It was an ordinary-looking office building, but intelligence indicated it was the nerve center of Serbian military communications in the region. Destroying it could save American and Allied lives by degrading enemy response capability. I reduced to 25,000 feet and prepared the bombs for release. The GBU-27s were precision munitions, guided by GPS and inertial navigation systems. Once released, they would find the target automatically, allowing me to begin evasive maneuvers immediately. At 21:17, I was ready for the attack. The target was clearly visible on sensors, the targeting system was locked, and the bombs were armed. All I needed to do was open the bomb bay doors and release the munitions. This was always the most vulnerable moment of any F-117 mission. For a few seconds, the open doors would significantly increase the aircraft's radar cross-section. But it was only a few seconds, and I was at 25,000 feet altitude. What difference could it make? "Bomb bay doors open," I murmured, following protocol even though I was alone. It was exactly at this moment that Danny decided to attack. The first SA-3 missile was fired at 21:17 and 45 seconds. He had waited patiently, tracking my approach, waiting for the moment when I would become more detectable. When my bomb bay doors opened, my radar signature increased enough for his systems to achieve a solid lock. The missile left the launcher with a fire trail visible for miles. But I still didn't know I was being attacked. I was too focused on my target, finalizing targeting calculations. "Releasing ordnance," I said, pressing the bomb release button. The two GBU-27s separated from the aircraft cleanly and silently. In a few seconds, they would begin their guided trajectory toward the Serbian command center. My part of the mission was almost complete. I closed the bomb bay doors and began a gentle left turn, starting the return route. For a few seconds, I felt the satisfaction of another successful mission. It was time to go home. That's when my RWR exploded in alerts. The sharp and urgent tone indicated that a missile was approaching. It wasn't a search radar signal, it was the specific sound every military pilot learns to fear. A radar-guided missile was locked onto my aircraft. Instantly, all my years of training kicked in. I cancelled the return procedure and began evasive maneuvers. I turned sharply right, increased engine power, and began descending rapidly. At the same time, I activated all available electronic countermeasures. Chaff and flares were automatically dispensed, small metal strips and flares to confuse the missile's guidance systems. The electronic jamming system tried to interfere with the missile's radar, but the S-125 was a persistent missile. Even with all the countermeasures, it continued approaching. Through my headset, the RWR tone became increasingly sharp and frequent. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it through my flight suit. I executed a more aggressive, evasive maneuver, turning sharply left and diving toward the ground. The F-117 wasn't designed for air-to-air combat maneuvers, but I was doing everything I could to avoid the missile. For a few seconds, I thought I had made it. The RWR tone decreased slightly, and I thought maybe the missile had lost its lock. Maybe the countermeasures had worked. Maybe I could escape. But Danny had learned from decades of experience that one missile was rarely enough. He had fired a second SA-3, time to intercept my evasive maneuvers. While I maneuvered to avoid the first missile, the second was approaching from a different angle. At 21:19 and 22 seconds, the second SA-3 missile detonated approximately 100 meters from my aircraft. The explosion was deafening. Even inside the pressurized cockpit with my flight helmet, I felt like someone had exploded a bomb next to my head. The entire aircraft shook violently, and instantly all warning systems began firing simultaneously. I looked at the instrument panel and saw something no pilot wants to see: red lights flashing on all major systems. The primary hydraulic system was failing. The electrical system was having problems. More importantly, the flight controls weren't responding normally. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Nighthawk 27 taking heavy damage, declaring emergency. I transmitted the emergency call, but quickly realized my communication systems had also been damaged. There was no response from air traffic control or data link systems. I was alone. The aircraft was beginning to vibrate abnormally. The left wing had been severely damaged by explosion fragments, and aerodynamics were compromised. Worse still, I was losing altitude rapidly. I tried to correct the problem using manual backup controls. The F-117 had redundant systems for most critical functions, but the damage was too extensive. The aircraft was beginning to enter an uncontrolled spin. 20,000 feet, 18,000, 15,000. The altimeter was dropping rapidly, and I was fighting to maintain some control over the aircraft. I tried every emergency procedure I knew, but nothing was working. At 21:20, with the aircraft at 12,000 feet and falling rapidly, I made the most difficult decision of my military career. I looked at the altimeter, 10,000 feet. I looked at the controls, not responding. I looked at the systems, all failing. There was nothing more I could do to save the aircraft. I placed my hand on the red and yellow ejection handle located between my legs. It was a handle I had practiced pulling thousands of times in training, but never expected to use in actual combat. For a few crucial seconds I hesitated. Ejecting meant more than just losing the aircraft. It meant that one of America's most advanced military technologies would fall into enemy hands. It meant I would become a prisoner of war in hostile territory. It meant my family would receive a call that all military families fear. But it also meant I would have a chance to survive. At 8,000 feet, with the aircraft completely out of control, I pulled the ejection handle. What followed was simultaneously terrifying and fascinating. The ACES-2 ejection system worked exactly as designed. In a fraction of a second, explosive charges shattered the canopy. Rockets propelled my seat out of the aircraft, and I found myself flying through the night air at hundreds of miles per hour. The ejection experience is hard to describe. One moment you're inside an aircraft, relatively protected and in control. The next moment you're in the middle of the sky, being whipped by violent winds, with only a few automatic systems between you and death. For the first few seconds, there was only the deafening roar of wind and the sensation of falling into the void. Then I felt the familiar tug of the main parachute opening. I looked up and saw the white fabric expanding against the starry sky, slowing my fall. Finally, there was relative silence. I swayed gently under the parachute, slowly descending through the darkness. Below, I could see the sparse lights of Serbian farms and villages. Behind me on the horizon, there was an orange glow where my F-117 had hit the ground. As I descended, I had time to mentally process what had happened. My aircraft, one of the most advanced in the world, had been shot down by a 1960s missile system. Not through technological superiority, but through human skill, patience, and strategy. I also had time to prepare for what came next. I was in hostile territory, alone with limited equipment. My chances of survival depended as much on luck as on training. I landed in an agricultural field about 30 kilometers southwest of Belgrade. The impact was gentler than expected. Parachute training had paid off. I quickly got rid of the parachute and ejection seat, which could be seen by enemy patrols. The first thing I did was assess my physical condition. Miraculously, I hadn't suffered serious injuries. Some minor cuts, some bruises, but nothing that would impair my mobility. The ejection had worked perfectly. Next, I checked my survival equipment. Emergency radio working, portable GPS working, water and emergency food supplies intact, medical kit intact. Personal defense weapon, a Beretta 9mm pistol with 3 magazines. I activated the emergency beacon and tried to establish contact with American forces. Any station, this is Vega 3-1. I am down. Request immediate assistance. There was no immediate response. I knew it could take hours before someone could locate me and organize a rescue operation. Until then, I needed to find a place to hide and wait. I found a small woods about 500 meters from the landing site. It wasn't an ideal hideout, but it offered some protection and cover. Using techniques learned during SEER, survival, evasion, resistance, escape training, I created an improvised hideout under some dense trees. SARE training was something every military pilot went through, but most hoped never to use. It taught how to survive in hostile territory, how to avoid capture, how to resist interrogation, and how to escape if captured. I was about to find out how well I had learned those lessons. The next few hours were some of the longest of my life. I constantly heard sounds, vehicles in the distance, voices speaking Serbian, helicopters flying over the area. I couldn't tell if they were friendly or enemy forces, so I stayed hidden. Every hour I tried to establish radio contact. I used specific codes that would identify my position and situation to American forces, but would be useless to anyone intercepting the transmissions. Basha 5-2, Basha 5-2, this is Vega 3-1. Grid November Delta 427891. Status Charlie. Request immediate extraction. At 2 hours AM, I finally received a response. Vega 3-1, this is Basha 5-2. We have your position. Extraction team is inbound. Estimate 30 minutes. Never had words sounded so sweet, but I also knew the next 30 minutes would be crucial. If Serbian forces were also looking for me, it would be a race against time. I could hear helicopters in the distance getting closer, but I couldn't tell if they were American or Serbian. The sound of rotors echoed through the valleys, making it impossible to determine the exact direction or number of aircraft. At 2:25 AM, I heard a voice on my radio that I'll never forget. Vega 3-1, this is Basha 5-2. We're overhead. Pop smoke if you can see us. I looked up through the trees and saw the dark silhouette of an HH-60 Pavehawk against the stars. It was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. I activated a signal flare and waved it above my head. I see your signal. Stay put, we're coming down. The rescue was executed with military precision. The helicopter descended rapidly, while F-16s provided air cover overhead. Special Forces soldiers rappelled down, located me, and had me inside the helicopter within minutes. When I felt the Pavehawk lift off the ground, I knew I was safe. During the flight back, I had time to reflect on what had happened. I had lost my aircraft, but I had survived. More importantly, I had learned a lesson I carry to this day. In modern warfare, technology is crucial, but it can never completely replace human skill, experience, and intelligence. Down below, Danny and his unit were celebrating a historic achievement. They had shot down an aircraft that was considered invincible, not through superior technology, but through intelligent tactics, patience, and deep knowledge of their equipment. Years later, I would have the opportunity to meet Danny personally. I discovered he was a respectful, professional man who had simply done his duty as a soldier. There was no personal malice in what he did. He was just a skilled soldier doing his job. What impressed me most was learning how he had managed to shoot me down. It wasn't luck or chance. It was the result of weeks of study, observation, and preparation. He had realized that despite our stealth technology, we still followed predictable patterns. He had understood that specific moments, like opening bomb bay doors, made us temporarily more vulnerable. More importantly, he had modified his tactics to work with his equipment's limitations. Instead of trying to use the S-125 radar conventionally, he had adapted his operation to detect weak, intermittent signals. He had turned a weakness into a strength. This experience completely changed my perspective on air warfare. I learned that no matter how advanced your technology is, there will always be someone on the other side trying to find ways to neutralize it. War isn't won just by whoever has the best equipment, but by whoever uses their equipment best. I also learned about the importance of humility. Flying an F-117 can give you a sense of invincibility. You feel like a ghost, untouchable, superior. But the reality is that all technology has limitations, and there's always someone working to find those limitations. After the incident, I returned to flying. I continued my Air Force career, but never again with the same blind confidence in technology. Every mission became a reminder that ultimately, military aviation is about people. People who design aircraft, people who fly them, people who attack them, and people who defend them. The F-117 I piloted that night was never recovered. Its wreckage was collected by Serbian forces and, ironically, studied to improve their air defenses. Part of the stealth technology that was supposed to protect us ended up being used to develop systems capable of detecting similar aircraft. It's one of the ironies of modern warfare. Every technological advance inevitably leads to the development of countermeasures. It's an eternal arms race, where advantage is always shifting sides. But the most important lesson I learned wasn't about technology or military tactics. It was about the value of human life. That night, two people, Danny and I, were doing our jobs. He trying to shoot me down, me trying to complete my mission. In the end, we both survived, we both learned something, and we both continued our lives. War can be cruel and impersonal, but ultimately it's always a human matter. It's people making decisions, people taking risks, people paying the price. And sometimes, when we're lucky, those people can meet years later, not as enemies, but as two professionals who respect each other. Today, when I tell this story to young pilots, I always emphasize a few points. First, never underestimate the enemy. No matter how superior you think you are, there's always someone on the other side working to find your weaknesses. Second, technology is a tool, not a guarantee. Ultimately, it's people who make the difference. And third, and perhaps most important, in war everyone is vulnerable. It doesn't matter if you're flying the world's most advanced aircraft or operating 1960s equipment. A moment of carelessness, a wrong decision, a bit of bad luck, and everything can change in seconds. That March night in 1999, I learned that even ghosts can be seen when hunters know where to look. I learned that invisibility is relative, that invincibility is an illusion, and that humility is an essential virtue for any military pilot. But I also learned about courage, not just the courage to fly dangerous missions, but the courage to admit when you're wrong, to learn from your mistakes, and to keep flying even after you fall. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. It's not how many times you fall that defines you as a pilot, but how many times you get up and return to the skies. If you enjoyed this true story from the skies, subscribe to Black Box so you don't miss the next accounts that show how aviation teaches us lessons about courage, technology, and above all about our humanity. Leave in the comments what aviation story you'd like to hear in the next episode.